Thank you so much for inviting me. We are not getting the presentation. There. Okay. Do you have a big screen that says plant it and they will come? Yes.
Looks good.
One of the other things that I have done in this Act 2 of my life is to be a past president and board member of Halifax River Audubon, as well as a member of our Central Florida Regional Conservation Committee. And I'm thrilled to be here today to talk to you. Oh dear. I just did something very strange. Sorry, I tried to get Claudia. There we go. I tried to, nope, that's not working for me. Okay. I needed to be able to see my screen. I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you today about how we can support birds and other wildlife in our own backyards and protect beautiful byways like the Ormond Scenic Loop and Trail, which, as Claudia just mentioned, I grew up along. I'm on that slice between the Halifax River and the Atlantic Ocean in Ormond by the Sea. And like all of us who've grown up along the route, I take a proprietary interest in it as if it were mine. The original version of this presentation, Plant It and They Will Come, was created by Audubon as part of its Plants for Birds program. I've added information to it in part from Dr. Don Spence, whom Joe just mentioned, and many of you know him from the guided trail talks he's given along the loop, to include some practical steps that we can take once we understand the problem. Because we do have a problem, and a pretty serious one, including locally, as this article from the News Journal shows. Birds truly are canaries in the coal mine of our environment, and they're suffering measurable consequences from our actions. For more than 100 years, Audubon has worked to protect birds in critical habitat, bird sanctuaries, and what Audubon designates as important bird areas. But it's become increasingly clear to us that if we want future generations to enjoy birds, we also have to work in cities and towns where most people live. So Audubon's Plants for Birds program focuses on giving birds the 5 basic things that they need to thrive, which are water, food, shelter, safe passage during migration, and places to raise their young. It's pretty much the same as what we people want as well. And there's a beautiful ruby-throated hummingbird. The wood thrush's story shows us why we need plants for birds. Maybe you've heard its beautiful song. You can still hear it in our forests, but our forests are growing quieter. Our forests are growing quieter as the wood thrush and many other songbirds disappear at alarming rates. The wood thrushes doesn't want to be quiet. The wood thrush's story is a lesson about what's happening in our yards, our neighborhoods, our local parks, and our workplaces, as well as in the wider landscape and in the tropics where many songbirds winter. The wood thrush, like most of the songbirds that breed in our forests, spends the winter in Central America. This neotropical migrant is just as at home in tropical rainforests as it is flitting among the branches of oaks and maples in North America. This map shows the breeding range of the wood thrush in orange and the winter range in blue. They migrate through our area, Florida, in the fall, and when they do, they need food, water, and a safe place to rest. They breed in the understory of woodlands where there are tall trees. They nest most successfully in large contiguous tracts of undisturbed forest, but they'll also nest in suburban woodlots and city parks where there are tall trees, but there they face many threats and often don't reproduce successfully. But they'll use any available green space to rest and refuel during their migration. Wood thrush populations have declined sharply over the past 50 years, in large part due to loss and fragmentation of suitable breeding habitat. There's been a cumulative decline of 55% over those 50 years. 41% of all neotropical migratory songbirds are declining. Here's a Florida summer nester, a yellow-billed cuckoo. The yellow-billed cuckoo breeds throughout Florida and has experienced a 52% decline, primarily, again, due to habitat loss. Cerulean warblers, like this prothonotary warbler, have seen population losses as well. We once had vast tracts of contiguous landscapes that supported a great diversity of native plants that in turn supported a diversity of wildlife, like along the loop. We've got the parks on one side, but we've got tremendous developmental pressures on the other. We've transformed much of our contiguous lands into a sterile monoculture of turfgrass lawns and decorative alien plant species. 54% of the U.S. land has been developed into a suburban-urban matrix, which is a patchwork of cities and towns with small remnants of fragmented habitat between and within them. Even when there is available green space, like in our yards, the typical yard looks like these, which provide no suitable habitat for the wood thrush or most other wildlife. In fact, the average American yard doesn't provide much for birds to eat or even places for them to hide from predators. And plants in suburban and urban landscaping tend to be about 80% non-native. But these developed areas aren't lost. We've come to understand that actually suburban and urban areas are critical for birds, and we can all work to make them more supportive to both migrating and breeding species. A big part of how to do that is by replacing non-native plants with natives. Excuse me. Let's look at what birds eat. Our native birds have evolved with native plants. Native plants provide both resident and migrating birds with what they need when they need it all year long. Native plants provide food in the form of berries and fruit, nuts and seeds, nectar, and what else? Anybody have any guesses? Well, here, our wood thrush is telling us what it is: bugs. This parent is feeding its chick a very juicy looking caterpillar, and indeed, a whopping 96% of land birds, like the wood thrush, feed insects to their chicks. Even hummingbirds feed insects to their babies. Almost all baby songbirds need protein-rich insects to properly develop. Here, the Prothonotary warbler has 3 morsels: a spider, a caterpillar, and some kind of a grub. If parent birds can't find these bugs, they have nothing to feed their babies. And baby birds eat a lot. A chickadee pair brings 390 to 570 caterpillars to the nest every single day. These chickadees start out very small. The eggs are like the tip of your pinky finger. And in just over 2 weeks, each one of these little birds has to grow from the size of a tiny egg to a little bird covered in feathers that can fly out of the nest. Chickadees feed their young for 16 days before they fledge. 570 for 16 days is more than 9,000 caterpillars that those parents have to go out and find. In this relationship between baby birds and insects, specialization is key. 90% of insects that eat plants only eat the plants with which they co-evolved over millennia. Here on the left, we have a native oak tree, and on the right, a non-native philodendron that used to be in my yard. You probably have one in yours too. Our native oaks in the genus Quercus are host to more than 550 species of caterpillars. Oaks are incredibly valuable to our wildlife. Whereas the philodendron, a species that is commonly planted but comes from Asia, attracts very few insects. When you're a bird looking for food for your young, that difference is critical. Exotic plants, meaning plants that weren't here until after the Europeans arrived, dominate the landscaping industry and the big box garden centers. And for the most part, they're unpalatable to our native insects. That's one of the big reasons why we plant them, because they're pest-free. Unfortunately, for our birds, pest-free means a sterile environment with no food for baby birds. Our current understanding of the importance of insects to birds and of native plants to our native insects is largely thanks to the pioneering research of entomologist Doug Tallamy. Since Bringing Nature Home, his first book, was published in 2009, his new books and essays are more urgent. In an April 2020 Smithsonian article, he stated that usually when insects disappear, humans don't take much notice, except for the beautiful monarch butterfly, which everyone can recognize, and the honeybee, needed for crop pollination. Tallamy says that these 2 insects are symptoms of a larger disruption of the ecosystem. You may have seen this German multi-year study that was released in 2017. Flying insect populations, which are the ones that we count on to pollinate crops to feed us, have fallen by about 80% 80% in the last 3 decades. 80% in 3 decades. That's astounding. Talamy says that this is an ecological crisis that we're just starting to talk about. He says the big problem is that we equate nature with wilderness, which excludes everyday landscapes that we're responsible for, that we have power over. If the insects cannot eat the plants in our landscape, the food chain is essentially broken, and a world without insects is a world not only without birds, but a world without biological diversity that includes us. Without insects, we would all go hungry. So if you remember nothing else from what I've said so far, please remember this. No native plants, no bugs, no birds. So you're probably wondering, what can I do? I've probably depressed you a little bit with the magnitude of this problem. But let's start with the easiest actions that you can take to help birds, which is what I set out to talk about. And these actions absolutely anyone can take. Number 1 is to keep your cat indoors. I do. According to the most current research, free-roaming outdoor cats are estimated to kill between 1.3 billion and 3.9 billion with a B birds each year. You can also help prevent window collisions that can kill an estimated 1 billion birds per year by making your window visible to birds. You can use tape, netting, or get a bird strike window cling like this one. If you have bird feeders, bring them to within 2 or 3 feet of your windows. The birds might still fly into them, but not with enough force to be injured. And birds need water. Aren't these little guys adorable? And there are many ways to add it to your landscape. I take the easy way. I use the saucers from planters and put them up on pedestals in my yard at different heights. I also leave some for my box turtles on the ground. And by simply reducing or eliminating pesticide, you can make your property healthier for birds as well as for your family and pets. I've honestly never understood why people would ever let their children or their dogs go onto a yard that has had a sign like this one on it. And finally, if you have a dead tree in your yard and it's safe to leave it up, please do. It provides nesting for cavity dwellers, and it's a great place for birds to snag insects from. Now, let's do a thought experiment. What does this have to do with this? The answer is they're both just fashions, nothing more. They're just styles. This landscape is one of them, and it's from the Volusia County website's code enforcement page as an example of, quote, a well-maintained yard. We've been conditioned to see landscapes like this one, neat and simple, with lots of lawn and a few exotic plants, as what we should strive for. But in fact, they're lifeless and sterile. And I'm going to eat up some time sharing a little anecdote from living along the loop. There was a vacant yard near my home. I walk a lot, and the vacant lot in the spring was full of wildflowers and many bees. There are over 300 species of bees in the state of Florida, and butterflies and birds, and they're all hanging out in this lot. And a few days later, I see the lot being cleared, but they've left a margin around the edge of all the wildflowers. And I'm like, wow, that's a really forward-thinking homeowner who's building on this lot. But no, a few days later, everything was gone. The fill dirt was brought in, the house was built, the sod was put in, the exotic foundation plantings were put in, and I have not seen a living thing on that property since. And I can't unsee it. Now that I've learned what I'm sharing with you, I see it as sterile. It's a sterile and lifeless landscape, and that's very sad. But it requires us to kind of change our mind about what beauty is. And as an example of that, here are some Florida native wildflowers that I have in my yard and that you probably mistakenly call weeds. All of these grow at different times during the year, and they're very beautiful. Here's a different concept of what is beauty and is real Florida, something that's much more nourishing for birds and wildlife. Native plants provide resources for both resident and migrating birds year-round and are better for the planet. Native plants generally require less water, less fertilizer, and less pesticide, and reducing your lawn means less gas guzzling and lawn mowing. Native plants support native pollinators, and they attract more birds. So here are some concrete steps that you can take to make your yard better for birds, for wildlife, and for Florida's water. All of these things that I'm going to talk about speak to what happens to our water as well. And we'll go through them one by one. One of the most important things you can do, especially if you live along a scenic byway, is to remove invasive species from your yard. Before you acquire any plant, check out its status first. There are a lot of sources, but UF-IFAS, Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, is a great resource. My next slides come from their website and are just a few common invasive plants that I have seen growing along the Ormond Scenic Loop and Trail. I've seen them in people's yards along John Anderson, and now I've seen them along the wild portions of the trail. They've escaped cultivation from the yards along the drive. The first one is Wedelia, or creeping oxeye daisy. A lot of people plant this. A great substitute is the native beech dune flower, Halianthus devilis. Mexican petunia. Before I found out about native plants, thanks to Dr. Don Spence, I was going to put some of these in my yard, and in fact I have some, although I've never planted them. I have to dig them up every year. This is a category 1 invasive, and it's legally sold in Florida. And I'm going to pause for a minute and explain what I mean by invasive. I don't mean that a plant spreads a lot. I mean that it invades wild areas and crowds out the native plants and disrupts an entire ecosystem. I didn't even bother with a picture of Brazilian pepper, but Brazilian pepper not only shades out other plants, it also has enzymes or substances that it puts out into the soil that kill off plants trying to germinate around it. And again, along the Ormond Scenic Loop and Trail, Rob and I got to meet with the Volusia County land management people who are doing Brazilian pepper removals at Bicentennial Park. Very interesting. Another ubiquitous plant is the Asparagus Fern. This is such a dense and spreading plant, it just completely crowds out anything around it. Tuberous sword fern. Birds cannot get down into that to feed on the ground. There are native varieties of sword fern. In the tree group, we have carrotwood. It's an attractive tree, terribly invasive. I pulled them out of my yard too, and I've never planted one. Chinese tallow. This is a terrible invasive, and they are looking at new biologic controls for it, meaning use of insects. And then lantana. This is a very common plant. Sometimes you can find sterile cultivars of this plant, but I just kind of steer clear of it. And finally, a beautiful plant that I love, but it's just a terrible plant to have near water bodies, and that's elephant ear. So if you have these in your yard, think about taking them out and bagging them up in a bag and putting them in with your regular waste, not with the yard waste that's going to get picked up. The next thing you can do is to practice Florida-friendly landscaping. And I'm just going to go through this real quickly. The first is the right plant in the right place. Research your plant, including what it needs to thrive before you buy it. And then you won't have to keep buying it every year. That won't make Home Depot happy, but it'll make your wallet happy. Water efficiently, early in the morning or late in the afternoon, and only when and where needed. Follow the Volusia County watering regulations, please. All of our water in Florida comes from underground aquifers, and everything that we do impacts those aquifers. Everything we draw out of it impacts the aquifers. Let your grass grow a little longer and don't water quite so much. If you're going to fertilize, do it appropriately. Use slow release nitrogen fertilizer only, no phosphorus unless you've had your soil tested. Volusia County has a fertilizer ordinance, which please do follow it. The Halifax River, which the Ormond Scenic Loop and Trail borders, is an impaired waterway from an excess of nutrients. Mulch, mulch, and more mulch. That's a great thing for your soil. It's a great thing for the water. It holds moisture. Attract wildlife to your yard. They're running out of habitat, and you can share your yard with them. Manage yard pests responsibly. Please don't ever put out poison bait for rodents in your yard. What you're going to end up doing is killing their predators, hawks and owls, which mate for life, by the way. And the same for mothballs. Every year I run around social media telling people that they should not put mothballs into their garden, aside from the fact that they don't repel pests. They're extraordinarily hazardous to all life, including us. Recycle your yard waste. Start a compost pile. It'll make good soil. And very important, reduce stormwater runoff. When you plant, plant with erosion in mind so that your water doesn't run into the gutter. If you put any chemicals on your lawn, it's going straight into the river or straight into the aquifer. Protect the waterfront. Don't fertilize within 15 feet of it. The next thing you can do is start to improve your habitat for birds as well as for Florida waters by replacing turf grass. We put 50% of our potable water onto our lawns and exotic ornamentals. Wouldn't it be better to leave the water on the landscape, in the wetlands, in the lakes, and in the rivers, and support these beautiful animals as well as others? You can replace your grass with mulch with islands like this one, and then you can expand them. And then finally, start adding native plants or swap out existing plants for natives. The goal is to try to get about 70% natives in your yard, and then you'll be supporting a diversity of insects and wildlife with those plants. You don't have to give up your hibiscuses. They're not hurting anybody. They just aren't doing anybody any good except us because we like looking at them. But even a small native garden has tremendous value for birds. And when you landscape, think like Mother Nature in layers. Think of an overstory, a canopy, which is the trees. Think of the mid-story layers, which are smaller trees and shrubs. And the understory, which is ground cover with grasses and broadleaf herbaceous plants. Doug Talamy has a new talk online that's fantastic. Grasses are incredibly important as well for insects to hide in, especially pollinators. And then something we don't usually talk about, leaf litter. That's super important, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So what should you plant? Here are just a few representative plants that you can grow to feed birds in our area. American beautyberry, gorgeous plant, and a gorgeous little black-throated blue warbler is eating a berry there. Here's a palm warbler, which are just cute as can be on a excuse me, on a goldenrod. In terms of species that are very valuable for the insects and therefore for the birds, any solidagos, any goldenrods, any asters, any halianthus like the beech dune flower, those are super valuable. And then the bushy blue stem also. Both of these plants have seeds from October through March, so you'll have birds around all winter. And here's a ruby-throated hummingbird on a coral honeysuckle. When she builds her nests and raises her babies, she's going to need nectar for herself, and this is a fabulous plant to provide it. I just put one in the ground in my backyard a couple weeks ago. And now back to the leaf litter. It's where a lot of birds, like this wood thrush, spend their time foraging. I'm sure you've seen plenty of little birds on the ground under your trees if you live in an area where you're fortunate enough to have some trees and leaf litter. Leaves and twigs of trees and shrubs help build up the soil, which is a great reason to cut down on the amount of raking you do. It's free mulch. And most moth caterpillars, which according to Doug Talamy are baby birds' favorite treat, most moth caterpillars fall to the ground and pupate in leaf litter and in the soil. So if you don't have a good ground layer, you won't support many caterpillars for growing birds or to become adult moths, which, believe it or not, are one of the most important pollinators we have, even more than butterflies. Fortunately, you don't have to memorize the plants or the birds. All you have to do is go online, and here's the URL at the top of the page, to Audubon's Plants for Birds database. The website's designed to help you find answers to plant choices and much more, including local resources. You just input your zip code, and the first thing that comes up is the best list of plants for your area. But there are filters that help you choose plants based on many different criteria of your choice. Just a couple of these are, what birds would you like to attract to your yard? Or what kind of plant are you looking for? And I'll put up a slide in a moment with other references. But before I do that and take questions, if there's time and if there are any, please remember again, no native plants, no bugs, no birds. And thank you. And I will put the slide up now that has a few references both around Florida and local to Volusia County. Thank you very much. And I'll leave that for just a moment and then I will stop sharing. Or if anybody wants these, I can send them out later.